if we look at some sort of key dates along the path, Hamilton arrival, 1600, a lot of that plantation. Hamilton, obviously a very significant name in Ulster history, Dukes of Abercorn, Rowan Hamiltons, Killaloe, and obviously, as we'll come on to, Hamiltons here. And then Blackwoods arrive, 1690. Cleverly marries Dorcas, whom we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. Baronetcy created, farming intervention, elevation to the baronetcy, which we'll talk a little bit about, and a redesign of the house in 1801. The architect, Robert Woodgate, you saw a picture of Barons Court earlier on. It was designed by Soane. Woodgate was a follower of Soane. He was an apprentice who was sent to Ireland to implement some projects. And that is the sort of history of how he came to live and work in Ireland. And then looking at the main man, so the Marquis was born in 1826. We're not actually going to talk about him much today. The 200th anniversary of his birth is on the weekend of June the 21st, and there'll be a series of events which is completely dedicated to remembering him and his birth at Clandeboye, so watch the press. So we thought we'd save no spoilers, we'd just save that until that happens. He comes into ownership of the estate at a very young age, which is a frequent theme, and makes substantial improvements to the estate, both in terms of landscaping. So a lot of the treescape and the landscaping that constitutes Clandeboye today was implemented by him during that period, leading to the construction of Helen's Tower in the late 1840s through to the 1850s as a memorial for his mother, Helen Sheridan, who herself was a granddaughter of Sheridan the playwright. Hence the very strong sort of literary and artistic connection that the house has. And then expansion of the house in the 1860s. But as Olwen has mentioned in his own right, Lord Dufferin was a very, very significant diplomat in the Victorian age. He was a personal friend of Victoria's, but started his main diplomatic career in the 1870s, starting with the Governor Generalship of Canada, and ending, well, not quite ending, but certainly at a high point, he was the Viceroy of India between 1884 and 1888. And that is significant because a lot of the artifacts and the collection that forms the historic collection of Clandeboye were really added to during that period. So Thor's Inn is from Burma stroke Myanmar. He has a personal connection to that part of the world, and he's now working at Clandeboye to collate all of that information and put it into sort of a documented form. As was common for those people that served as Viceroy, Dufferin was appointed to the Marquisate in 1888 and continued his diplomatic career thereafter. He served as ambassador to France in the late 1890s before retiring back to Clandeboye. I've mentioned the memorabilia. There was an exhibition in 1900 of the collection, if I could call it that, which is something which, again, I'd hope we would replicate as a memorial to him later on this year in June. And he himself died in 1902 and is buried on the estate. There's a family burial plot called the Camposanto, which is historically an old tomb, and lots of members of the family from that date onwards are buried in that location. Olwen has already mentioned the training camp, and you've seen the pictures. That is quite amazing military history. We're working with North Down Borough Council, who is very keen, or North Down at Ards, I should say, is very keen to bring forward that military history. And particularly, not only did the men train at Clandeboye, but a lot of the trench warfare that was then adopted at the Somme was actually trialled at Clandeboye before the men went to the front. We've touched upon the Thiepval replica, but also that military history continues into the Second World War. American and British troops were stationed at Clandeboye. There's a lot of, believe me, when they're out ploughing, very often there are old mortars that are turned up when they're laying down crop. And the fourth Marquis himself was killed at the very end of the war when he was in Burma. So the title, in case you don't know, Dufferin and Ava. Dufferin is obviously the Northern Irish element of it, linking to the Killalay, which did form part of the estate at one point. And Ava is Ava in Burma, so it's the two bits. The irony is the fourth Marquis died very close to Fort Dufferin in Ava, just towards the very end of the war. And then we come into the fifth Marquis Sheridan and his wife Lindy, whom you probably all know of, and a slight renovation of how the estate operated. So from that period forward, very strong focus on forestry. Clandeboye is one of the largest broadleaf forests in Northern Ireland, certainly. Implementation of yogurt, which I hope you not only know but buy frequently. We should have brought some as a sample this morning. And then, very sadly, Lindy Lady Dufferin died in 2020. I had been her lawyer for a number of years before that, but also a very good friend, and had worked closely with her as to what the future of Clandeboye might be, because she did not want it to become a sort of ossified Irish country estate. She herself was both an entrepreneur and very outward looking, and she wanted that spirit to be continued, but we'll come on to chat a bit about that later on. So, as I've said, we deliberately are not looking at Dufferin today because we thought we'd look at the women behind the men of Clandeboye as a way of looking at their achievements. So, the first in that is Dorcas. Second, Harriet Rowan Hamilton, who became the first Marchioness of Dufferin and Ava, and then obviously Lindy Lady Dufferin herself. This is a picture of Dorcas which is in the house. She was born Dorcas Stevenson and became the heiress to a very wealthy landowner called James Stevenson. The Blackwoods married into that money and that land, thereby consolidating quite a lot of wealth and quite a lot of land. Interestingly, within the context of the peerage, she was created a peeress in her own right. She supported the Act of Union, which wasn't necessarily a common thing to do amongst the family at that period of time, but in recognition for that, she was appointed a baroness, and then that devolved to her son upon her death. But Dorcas, it's quite an interesting portrait, I think. That's quite a nose that she has, but that is the person who basically brought the thing together. This is the house that existed, Ballylady House, which is what I would describe as sort of fairly typical Ulster plantation house. If you know Saintfield House, if you know Ballydugan House in County Down, they're quite similar in style, quite a plain Georgian facade. Whereas in 1801 and 1804, Dorcas's son starts to mansionize the house into the house that you see today. So quite a transformation during that period of time. The second woman that we wanted to touch upon is Harriet Rowan Hamilton. She was born in 1843. She died at Clandeboye in 1836, aged 93. But in herself is quite an interesting character, a very strong woman. You see her there, so I think that picture, which again is in the house, painted roughly about when she was 19. So she was a teenager, lived at Killalay, was connected to her future husband, and married, and by 1820, sort of by the age she was 23, she plus whatever children they had then became the Governor General of Canada. So quite a leap from Killalay to becoming the Governor General of Canada. But she grew into this very stately global stateswoman, recognized across the globe for her presence, but also for her tenacity. She had 5 daughters, 7 sons, not all of whom survived, but also really adopted the role of a diplomat's wife in a very serious way. And to give a very brief example of that, I'll mention what is still, it's a charity which she set up with the help of Queen Victoria, still going to this day. It's properly known as the National Association for Supplying Female Aid to the Women of India, but also known as the Dufferin Fund. And it specialised in the building of hospitals and healthcare for millions of what would have been very impoverished Indian women during the time of her period as viceroy. And as I say, the remarkable thing from my perspective is that that charity is still going and it's still functioning to this day, which is quite a testament. Rudyard Kipling, his father Lockwood was the keeper of antiquities in India when they were viceroy and vicereine, and he wrote a poem called The Song of the Women, which is a poem on behalf of the women of Udaipur to Harriet. At that stage, she was Countess of Dufferin, just celebrating her achievements on behalf of the women of India at that stage. So there is an amazing, it's one of my favorite things in the house, an amazing book signed by 5,000 women of the Punjab to Harriet, which is in a silver casket in the house. And it's an amazing, it's not quite the Book of Kells, but it's an amazing calligraphy. And then you've got the signatures of those women of the day. So as I say, that teenager from Killalay grew into this somewhat exceptional viceroy. This is a box that was donated to her before she left India, sitting on the throne of the Maharaja Ranjit Singh somewhere around 1888 and we've recently had some academics at the house, and they were able to translate the Sanskrit around the circumference of it, just explaining the provenance of it. That's something which has come to light in the last month. So you're always finding something that is new and interesting every time that there is a sort of further investigation. More importantly, I think historically, Alwyn mentioned about the Doomsday Book, but Harriet was also very useful in that she wrote 2 volumes of her own travels, our viceregal life in India, with photographs and with a sort of very human explanation of what they were doing on a day-to-day basis during their lives when they were in India, which is a great reference point, not just historically, but also it pinpoints some of the artifacts that still exist in the house. So, for example, there is an entry where 2 statues are found near the temple at Mingun, and those are in the house. And one of the last sort of things that Lady Dufferin did shortly before she did was to have those restored. So they went off to England and they've come back and are restored and are now in the house in perpetuity. And speaking of Lindy Lady Guinness, most of you will know she inherited the house and land in 1988 on her husband's death. She was artist, conservationist, and indeed the last Marchioness. So the Marquisate started in 1888, ended in 1988, so it lasted simply the 100 years, but obviously because she was married to the last Marquis, she continued with the title. She was married at Westminster Abbey in 1964, as I used to tease her, with 1,800 of her closest friends. And this is a picture of she and Sheridan on their wedding day. But her vision, certainly during her lifetime, and I saw John Witchell arrive, so certainly during her lifetime, and something which she has charged her trustees with going forward, is that Clandeboye is not just kept as a monument to the past, but that it is a living, working estate, very much centered on that creative element that she was so passionate about, but also about sustainability. As I said, I had lots of conversations with her about her vision, and art was a very big part of that from her perspective. The way she described it, and it remains with me, which I think it certainly was resonant from my perspective, is she said art gave her everything that she ever loved. It gave her the people she loved, including her late husband, but also gave her a way of looking at life and looking at people in a way that she otherwise wouldn't have had. And I think that's quite a good lesson probably for all of us. and again is very much part of the theme that we as the trustees would like to take forward. As I say, she was an entrepreneur, founded Clandeboye Yogurt in 2007, essentially as a way of preserving and sustaining the estate. Estates like Clandeboye are not easy places to manage or run, and particularly not in the current climate. I happen to be a trustee for some of the other places that appeared on Alwyn's slides, and it is difficult. It is difficult to keep them alive and the roof on, the water running out. It's not quite back to Caroline Blackwood's description, but it's very hard to keep the roof on. Lindy was very keen at looking at entrepreneurial ways of managing that, because the reality is that if you are not moving forward, you're moving backwards. And that was very much her theme. So, as you may or may not know, shortly before her death, she signed a contract for a new yogurt factory. And I did say to her, she was approaching a significant birthday, and I said, do you really want to sign a contract for this heading towards your 80th birthday? And her words were, let's have a go. And that's what continues. And then, as I've mentioned, Clandeboye is important from an ecological point of view. It is an unspoiled landscape in the context of Northern Ireland. She described it as the lung of North Down. And certainly, as you fly over, it's very noticeable when you're crossing over Clandeboye, because you see, whether it's day or night, you just see this huge area of either dark at night or green during the day. And it's that preservation of that landscape that was very keen to her heart. So, in terms of that conservation aspect, as I say, that the estate is over 2,000 acres. It is a sustainable farm. It has a significant woodland, both historic, but also, as I've mentioned, that broadleaf coverage. And that is something which, a lot of that was planted 150, 200 years ago. Given the storms that we've had over the last number of years, it is being tested and some of it coming to the end of its natural life. So there is a regeneration that is required in terms of replanting and making sure that sustainable landscape is maintained. Agriculture, I've already mentioned the Clandeboye yogurt. If I plug it again, will you buy more? But anyway, keep buying it. It's a prize-winning project and is something that I think is good for North Down. And the council have sponsored and maintain an annual award in Lady Dufferin's memory to recognise that sort of entrepreneurial spirit which she had. And then events, the courtyard, as you probably are familiar with, Olwen had a picture of it during a summer event not so very long ago, but used for music, weddings and cultural festivals. Most of you will have come across Camerata. I hope most of you have attended it. Well, its 25th anniversary is this summer. So not only do we have the 200th anniversary of the birth of the first Marquess, we have the 25th anniversary of Camerata, which is at the end of August. And again, that will be an opportunity to celebrate some of the cultural aspects of Clandeboye. So in terms of that succession of influence, I thought everyone talks about Dufferin. What they don't necessarily talk about is the women behind those people. So Dorcas, Money and Land, Harriet, growing from a County Down teenager into a stateswoman of some renown, and Lindy Lady Dufferin, who in her own way added to that story and maintained Clandeboye, but more particularly set up the structure for its future, which I'll come on to at the moment. Now, one of the questions I'm very often asked about is the DNA, and if we just look, this is the Dufferin tiara. It's the coronet of a marquisate, but encrusted in diamond. This is in the V&A Museum in London, and is a magnificent piece of jewellery. If we just flip on to the next, you'll see it in practical use. So there is the Vicereine wearing it back in the 1880s, and this is Lindy wearing it in 1964 on her marriage. So, Dufferin Foundation, it was set up by the fifth Marquis and Marchioness before his death in 1988, and aims for a long-term viable solution to preserve Clandeboye. So the mission and values for that are research and education, so advancement of research and education in relation to both the family and Clandeboye estate itself, which is something that's ongoing. As Olwen has mentioned, we're participating in a project at the minute with Mount Stuart, two great diplomats, Viscount Castlereagh. It is remarkable, I think, that you've got two such successive diplomats in the same sort of area at the same sort of time on the global stage. That, for Northern Ireland, I think is a pretty unique situation. Preservation of buildings and environment of Clandeboye, which, as I've explained, is an ongoing thing. It's a bit like the Firth Bridge, you never finish. But if you don't do it, then it becomes a problem. And the preservation and display of the historical collection, and I've already mentioned Thor's Inn, who is a Burmese national but has studied at SOAS in London and is now collating in a new and fresh way what is a very valuable collection. Like the sad irony is that there is more outside Burma / Myanmar at the moment that is in need of preservation than there is within that country, given its current turmoils.